My brother's love and protection.
When Akin held the cries, they were soft at first, almost indistinguishable from the usual morning sounds. But as he rubbed the sleep from his eyes and listened more intently, he realized that these cries were different, high-pitched and desperate, like the wail of a small, frightened animal. Akin, just 10 years old, quickly threw off his blanket and hurried out of his small room. He found his mother, E.W.T, standing in the hallway, staring blankly into the living room where a small bundle lay in a basket. The baby, his half-sister Kemi, was crying, her tiny fists waving in the air as if searching for comfort. E.W.T's face was a mask of stone. She didn't move, didn't blink. It was as if she was frozen, unable, or unwilling to respond to the cries. Akin felt a pang in his chest as he looked at his mother. She had changed so much since his father, Ade, had left. The vibrant, loving woman he remembered had been replaced by someone who seemed distant and cold. Without a word, Akin stepped past his mother and approached the basket. Kemi's cries grew louder as he got closer. She was so small, her face red from the effort of crying. Akin carefully reached into the basket and lifted her into his arms. The moment she felt his touch, her cries began to soften, and she turned her tear-streaked face toward him. "It's okay, Kemi," Akin whispered, rocking her gently. "I'm here. I'll take care of you." He wasn't sure where the words came from or why he felt such a strong need to say them, but as he cradled Kemi in his arms, he knew that they were true. He would take care of her, no matter what. Akin carried Kemi to the small kitchen where he found a bottle of formula. He had seen his mother prepare it once before, and although his hands trembled slightly, he managed to make the bottle just as she had. He tested the temperature on his wrist, just like he had seen in the movies, before gently pressing the nipple to Kemi's lips. Kemi latched on immediately, suckling greedily as if she hadn't eaten in days. Akin watched her with a mixture of awe and sadness. She was so helpless, so innocent. None of this was her fault, yet she was the one who was suffering. When the bottle was empty, Akin carefully bathed her and then took her to the small bathroom. He filled the basin with warm water and, after making sure it wasn't too hot, he began to bathe her. His movements were slow and careful, almost reverent. He washed her tiny body, speaking to her in a soft, soothing voice the entire time. Kemi gazed up at him with wide, trusting eyes, her earlier distrust forgotten. Akin felt a strange warmth spread through his chest as he realized that she was beginning to trust him, that she felt safe in his care. Once she was clean, he dried her off and dressed her in a fresh onesie. By the time he was done, Kemi's eyelids were drooping, and she was on the verge of sleep. Akin carried her back to the living room and gently laid her down in the basket. He stood there for a moment, watching as she drifted off into a peaceful slumber. Akin turned to leave, but as he did, he noticed his mother still standing in the hallway. Her arms were crossed tightly over her chest, and her face was pale, almost as if she had seen a ghost. But her eyes were filled with something Akin had never seen before. Was it guilt, shame, regret? He couldn't tell. "Mama?" he asked hesitantly. E.W.T didn't respond. She just stood there, staring at the sleeping baby as if she were something foreign, something she couldn't quite understand. Akin took a step closer, his heart aching for his mother. She's just a baby, Mama, Akin said softly. She didn't do anything wrong. E.W.T's eyes flickered to Akin, and for a moment, he thought he saw a glimmer of the woman she used to be. But it was gone as quickly as it had appeared, replaced by the same cold, distant expression she had worn for months. Go to school, Akin, she said in a voice that was devoid of emotion. You'll be late. Akin opened his mouth to say something, to plead with her to hold Kemi, to love her the way a mother should. But the words stuck in his throat, and he found himself nodding instead. Yes, Mama, he whispered. He grabbed his schoolbag and left the house, casting one last glance at his baby sister before closing the door behind him. As he walked to school, his mind was filled with thoughts of Kemi. He couldn't shake the feeling that she was going to need him more than he had ever imagined. And he vowed, right then and there, that he would be there for her, no matter what. The years that followed were filled with challenges. Akin's life became a balancing act between school, household chores, and caring for Kemi. His mother's indifference toward Kemi never waned, and Akin was often left to manage everything on his own. Every morning before school, Akin would prepare breakfast for Kemi, dress her, and make sure she was comfortable. After school, he would rush home to take care of her, feed her and play with her until it was time for bed. Despite the exhaustion that came with his new responsibilities, Akin never complained. He loved Kemi with a fierce protectiveness that only grew stronger with time. As Kemi grew, she began to notice the coldness in their mother's eyes whenever she was around. She would often ask Akin why Mama didn't want to play with her or hold her like the other mothers she saw in the neighborhood. Akin's heart would break a little more each time he had to find an excuse to protect Kemi from the harsh truth. One afternoon, when Kemi was about 4 years old, she came home from playing outside with the other children in the neighborhood. Her cheeks were flushed, and her eyes were bright with excitement as she ran into the house to find Akin. Akin, Akin, she called, her voice filled with joy. Look what I made. Akin was in the kitchen, preparing dinner. He wiped his hands on a towel and turned to see Kemi holding up a small, handmade bracelet. It was made of colorful beads strung together with a piece of string, and she held it out to him with pride. I made it for Mama, Kemi said, her smile wide. Do you think she'll like it? Akin's heart tightened in his chest. He knew that E.W.T wouldn't react the way Kemi hoped, but he couldn't bring himself to crush her enthusiasm. I'm sure she'll love it, Akin said, forcing a smile as he knelt down to her level. Why don't you go and give it to her? Kemi's face lit up with excitement, and she hurried off to find their mother. Akin stood up and watched her go, his chest heavy with dread. He knew that Kemi's innocent gesture would likely be met with indifference, or worse, but there was nothing he could do to stop it. A few minutes later, Kemi returned to the kitchen, her smile gone and her shoulders slumped. She held the bracelet in her small hand, her fingers clutching it tightly as if it were the most precious thing in the world. Mama said she doesn't want it, Kemi whispered, her voice trembling. She said she doesn't need it. Akin's heart shattered at the sight of his little sister's dejected face. He walked over to her and gently took the bracelet from her hand. Let me see, he said softly. This is beautiful, Kemi. You did such a great job. Kemi looked up at him, her eyes filled with unshed tears. Do you really think so? Akin smiled and nodded. I do. And you know what? I would love to have this bracelet. It would make me really happy. Kemi's face brightened slightly, and she handed the bracelet to Akin. You can have it, Akin, she said, her voice still small. I want you to have it. Akin took the bracelet and slipped it onto his wrist, making sure she could see how much it meant to him. Thank you, Kemi. I'll wear it every day. Kemi's smile returned, though it was smaller and more subdued. She reached up to hug Akin, and he held her tightly, wishing he could protect her from the harsh realities of their life. As they stood there in the kitchen, Akin made a silent promise to himself. He would always be there for Kemi, no matter what. He would protect her from the pain that life seemed determined to throw at them, even if it meant shielding her from the truth about their mother's indifference. And in that moment, with Kemi's small arms wrapped around him, Akin knew that he would do whatever it took to keep that promise. As Kemi grew older, the questions began to pile up. Akin had always done his best to shield her from their mother's coldness, but there were moments when he couldn't hide the truth. He saw the confusion in Kemi's eyes when E.W.T ignored her or dismissed her attempts at affection. He noticed the way Kemi hesitated before approaching their mother, as if bracing herself for rejection. By the time Kemi turned 7, she had learned to keep her distance from E.W.T. She no longer tried to win her mother's approval or affection. Instead, she sought solace in Akin, who had become more than just a brother to her. He was her protector, her confidant, her only source of unconditional love. One evening, after a particularly difficult day at school, Kemi found Akin in their small hideout, a makeshift fort they had built in the woods behind their house. It was a place where they could escape from the world, where they could be themselves without fear of judgment or rejection. Akin was sitting on a log, deep in thought, when Kemi approached. He looked up and smiled as she sat down beside him, but he could see that something was bothering her. What's wrong, Kemi? He asked gently, placing a hand on her shoulder. Kemi hesitated, biting her lip as she tried to find the right words. Akin, do you think Mama loves me? The question hung in the air between them, heavy and painful. Akin felt his heart sink as he looked into his sister's eyes. He had always known that this day would come, but that didn't make it any easier to face. Of course she loves you, Kemi, Akin said, forcing a smile. She's just going through a lot right now. Kemi looked down at her hands, fidgeting with the hem of her dress. But why doesn't she show it? Why doesn't she talk to me or hug me like she does with you? Akin swallowed the lump in his throat, searching for an answer that would suit her without betraying the truth. Mama's been hurt a lot in the past, Kemi. Sometimes, when people are hurt, it makes it hard for them to show their love. But that doesn't mean it's not there. Kemi looked up at him, her eyes filled with doubt. But what if she never shows it? What if she never loves me the way she loves you? Akin felt a pang of guilt at her words. He knew that E.W.T's affection for him was only a shadow of what it had once been, but it was still more than she ever showed Kemi. He wished he could take away her pain, but he also knew that he couldn't lie to her, not about something so important. I don't know, Kemi, Akin admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. But I do know that I love you, and I always will. No matter what happens. Kemi leaned against him, resting her head on his shoulder. I love you too, Akin. You're the best brother in the world. Akin wrapped his arm around her, holding her close as the sun began to set behind the trees. He knew that his love for Kemi couldn't replace the love she craved from their mother, but he hoped that it would be enough to help her through the difficult days ahead. As they sat together in the fading light, Akin made another silent promise to himself. He would always protect Kemi from the harshness of the world, even if it meant standing up to their mother. He would never let her feel unloved or unwanted, no matter how difficult things became. And as the stars began to appear in the sky, Akin vowed to keep that promise for as long as he lived. The years passed, and with them, E.W.T's bitterness deepened. Her anger toward Ade festered like an open wound, refusing to heal. It was as if his betrayal had poisoned her soul, turning her into someone Akin barely recognized. The loving mother he had once known was gone, replaced by a woman consumed by resentment and grief. E.W.T's bitterness was most often directed at Kemi, who had become a constant reminder of Ade's infidelity. Every time E.W.T looked at Kemi, she saw the woman who had stolen her husband's love, and the pain of that betrayal was too much for her to bear. She lashed out in small, hurtful ways, cold words, dismissive gestures, and an ever-present distance that left Kemi feeling isolated and unwanted. Akin watched helplessly as his mother's behavior grew more toxic. He could see the toll it was taking on Kemi, who had become quieter and more withdrawn as the years went by. She no longer asked about their mother's love. Instead, she had learned to accept that it might never come. But even as Kemi grew more independent, Akin's protective instincts never wavered. He made sure to be there for her in every way he could, helping with homework, listening to her worries, and offering comfort when the weight of their mother's indifference became too much to bear. One evening, when Akin was 17 and Kemi was 10, E.W.T's anger reached a boiling point. It was a day like any other, with Akin and Kemi sitting at the kitchen table doing their homework. E.W.T was in the living room, staring blankly at the television, her mind elsewhere. Kemi had just finished her math assignment and was about to ask Akin for help with her reading when E.W.T suddenly stormed into the kitchen. Her face was twisted with fury, her eyes blazing with a rage that Akin had never seen before. "What is this?" E.W.T spat, slamming a piece of paper onto the table in front of Kemi. Kemi flinched at the harshness in her mother's voice and looked down at the paper. It was a drawing she had made at school, a picture of their family, with Akin, E.W.T, and herself all holding hands and smiling. "It's just a picture, Mama," Kemi said quietly, her voice trembling. "A picture," E.W.T hissed, her voice dripping with venom. "This isn't a family. This is a lie. There's no place for you in this family." Akin felt a surge of anger rise within him as he saw the fear in Kemi's eyes. He couldn't stay silent any longer. "Mama, stop it," Akin shouted, standing up from his chair. "She's just a child. She didn't do anything wrong." E.W.T turned her furious gaze on Akin, her chest heaving with anger. "She's not a child. She's a mistake, a reminder of everything that's gone wrong in this family. You should be ashamed for even defending her." Akin's hands clenched into fists as he struggled to control his temper. "She's your daughter, Mama. How can you say that about her?" E.W.T's face twisted with bitterness, and for a moment, it seemed as though she might strike Akin. But then, just as suddenly as her anger had flared, it subsided, leaving her looking exhausted and broken. "You don't understand, Akin," she said, her voice cracking. "You'll never understand." Without another word, E.W.T turned and walked out of the kitchen, leaving Akin and Kemi standing in stunned silence. Kemi's eyes filled with tears as she looked up at her brother. "Why does she hate me so much, Akin? What did I do wrong?" Akin felt his heart break at the sight of his sister's tears. He knelt down beside her and pulled her into a tight embrace, wishing he could take away her pain. "You didn't do anything wrong, Kemi," Akin whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "It's not your fault. Mama's just hurting, and she doesn't know how to deal with it. But that doesn't mean you're not loved. I love you, Kemi. You're the most important person in my life." Kemi buried her face in Akin's shoulder, her small body shaking with sobs. Akin held her close, silently vowing to protect her from their mother's anger, no matter what it took. As he comforted his sister, Akin couldn't help but feel a deep sense of sorrow for their mother. He knew that she was suffering, that her anger was rooted in pain she couldn't escape. But he also knew that her behavior was damaging Kemi in ways that might never be fully healed. And as Akin held Kemi in his arms, he realized that the rift between them and their mother had grown too deep to be easily mended. The family that had once been whole was now shattered, and Akin didn't know if it could ever be put back together. But one thing was certain: he would never stop fighting for Kemi, no matter how difficult things became. He would be her protector, her shield, her unwavering source of love in a world that often seemed determined to hurt her. And as the night wore on, Akin vowed once again to keep that promise for as long as he lived. By the time Akin turned 18, he had become the man of the house in every sense of the word. E.W.T's bitterness had only grown over the years, and she often withdrew into herself, leaving Akin to handle most of the responsibilities. Kemi, now 11, had learned to rely on her brother for everything, from the smallest comfort to the biggest life decisions. Their bond had grown even stronger over the years, forged in the fires of shared hardship. Akin had become Kemi's hero, her guardian, and in many ways, her only true parent. He had sacrificed so much for her: his social life, his free time, even his own dreams. But he never complained, because Kemi's happiness was worth more to him than anything else. But just as Akin was beginning to think they had found a fragile sense of peace in their broken family, the past came crashing back into their lives. It was a rainy afternoon when Ade, their father, returned. Akin and Kemi were sitting in the living room, playing a board game to pass the time. The sound of the doorbell was a rare occurrence in their home, and Akin frowned as he got up to answer it. When he opened the door, he was met with a sight that made his heart stop. Standing on the doorstep, drenched from the rain, was Ade. He looked older, wearier, and there was a heaviness in his eyes that hadn't been there before. But there was no mistaking him. Akin hadn't seen his father in nearly 9 years, but he recognized him instantly. "Akin," Ade said, his voice rough with emotion. I'm sorry for showing up like this, but I had to see you." For a moment, Akin couldn't find the words. Anger, confusion, and a deep sense of betrayal all surged through him at once. This was the man who had abandoned them, who had left them to pick up the pieces of a shattered family. And now he was back, as if he could just walk in and pretend nothing had happened. "What are you doing here?" Akin finally managed to say, his voice cold and distant. Ade looked down, shame etched into every line of his face. "I know I have no right to be here. I know I hurt you and your mother, and Kemi. But I've changed, Akin. I've spent these years trying to be a better man. And I've come back because I want to make things right." Akin's fists clenched at his sides. He wanted to tell his father to leave, to go back to wherever he had been hiding all these years. But before he could speak, Kemi appeared beside him, curiosity in her eyes. "Akin, who is it?" she asked, peering around him to see the man standing at the door. When her eyes landed on Ade, they widened in shock. She had seen pictures of their father, had heard stories from Akin about the man he used to be, but she had no memory of him. To her, Ade was little more than a ghost from the past, a figure who existed only in faded photographs and whispered conversations. Ade's gaze softened as he looked at Kemi, and a flicker of guilt crossed his face. "Kemi, you've grown so much. I'm your father." Kemi stared at him, her expression unreadable. She had heard stories about her father from Akin, but she had never expected to meet him. And now that he was standing in front of her, she didn't know how to feel. Before she could respond, E.W.T appeared in the hallway. Her face went pale when she saw Ade, and for a moment, it seemed as though she might collapse. But then her eyes narrowed, and a deep, burning anger filled her gaze. "Ade," E.W.T spat, her voice trembling with fury. "What are you doing here?" Ade's shoulders sagged under the weight of her anger, but he didn't back down. "E.W.T, I know I hurt you. I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I'm asking for it anyway. I want to be a part of our children's lives again." E.W.T let out a bitter laugh, her hands shaking. "You want forgiveness? After all these years? After everything you've put us through? How dare you show your face here?" Akin felt the tension between his parents like a physical force, and he stepped in front of Kemi, shielding her from the intensity of their confrontation. He knew this was a moment he had dreaded for years, and he wasn't sure how to navigate it. "Let him speak, Mama," Akin said quietly, his voice steady despite the storm raging inside him. "We deserve to hear what he has to say." E.W.T's eyes flashed with anger, but she beat back her retort. She crossed her arms over her chest and glared at Ade, waiting for him to continue. Ade took a deep breath, his eyes pleading as he looked from Akin to E.W.T and then to Kemi. "I know I was a coward. I ran away when things got hard, and I've regretted it every day since. But I've changed. I've been working to be a better person, and I want to be here for my children now. I want to make amends, if you'll let me." Akin's heart was torn in two. On one hand, he wanted to protect Kemi and E.W.T from any more pain that Ade might bring. But on the other hand, he could see the sincerity in his father's eyes, the deep remorse that came from years of regret. Akin knew that forgiveness wasn't something that could be given easily, but he also knew that it was a path to healing, a path they all desperately needed. Kemi, who had remained silent through the confrontation, finally spoke up. Her voice was small, almost fragile, but it carried a weight that made everyone listen. "Why did you leave us?" she asked, her eyes fixed on Ade. "Why did you leave me?" Ade's face crumpled at her words, and tears filled his eyes. I was scared, Kemi. I was scared of the mess I'd made, of the hurt I caused. But I was wrong to leave. I should have stayed and faced the consequences. And I'm so sorry for what I did to you. Kemi looked at him for a long moment, searching his face for the truth. She didn't know if she could trust him, didn't know if she could open her heart to the man who had caused her so much pain, even indirectly. But she could see the sincerity in his eyes, the deep remorse that couldn't be faked. Akin watched his sister's face, seeing the conflict within her. He knew that this decision would be hers to make, and he would support her no matter what she chose. Finally, Kemi took a step forward, her small hand reaching out to grasp Ade's. I don't know if I can forgive you yet, she said quietly. But I want to try. Ade's breath caught in his throat as he looked down at Kemi's hand in his. He nodded, tears slipping down his cheeks. Thank you, Kemi. That's all I can ask for. E.W.T watched the exchange, her expression unreadable. She had never truly moved on from the betrayal, and the sight of Ade in their home again felt like reopening a wound that had never fully healed. But as she looked at her daughter's face, at the tentative hope in her eyes, E.W.T realized that this was a chance for Kemi to have something she had never experienced, a relationship with her father. It wouldn't be easy, and the road to forgiveness would be long and fraught with challenges. But E.W.T knew that if she denied Ade the chance to make things right, she would be hurting Kemi more than anyone else. With a heavy sigh, E.W.T stepped forward and looked Ade in the eyes. I don't know if I can ever forgive you, Ade. But for the sake of our children, I'll allow you to try. But don't think for a second that I'll let you hurt them again. Ade nodded, his gaze steady. I understand, E.W.T. I won't let you down. Akin stood silently as his parents reached a fragile truce, his emotions in turmoil. He had spent years building a wall around his heart, protecting himself and Kemi from the pain of their father's absence. Now, that wall was beginning to crumble, and he wasn't sure if he was ready to face what lay on the other side. But as he looked at Kemi's hopeful expression, Akin knew that he would do whatever it took to support her, no matter how difficult the road ahead might be. And so, with a mixture of apprehension and cautious hope, Akin took the first steps toward a new chapter in their lives, one that would test the bonds of family like never before. Ade's return was far from the healing balm he hoped it would be. Although he made earnest attempts to repair the fractured relationships within the family, the deep scars left by his betrayal proved difficult to mend. Akin, who had shouldered the burden of responsibility for so long, found it especially hard to let go of the resentment he harbored toward his father. Despite Ade's efforts to reconnect with his children, Akin remained distant. He was polite and respectful, but there was a wall between them that Ade couldn't seem to break through. Akin's primary focus was still on Kemi. He had spent so many years protecting her from the harshness of the world, particularly the coldness of their mother, that it had become second nature to him. Even with their father back in their lives, Akin couldn't bring himself to step back, to let Ade take over a role he had long abandoned. Ade, for his part, was patient. He understood that rebuilding trust would take time, and he didn't push Akin or Kemi to forgive him overnight. Instead, he focused on being present, attending Kemi's school events, helping with homework, and trying to be the father he should have been all along. He also took time to talk with Akin, Not about the past but about the future, trying to find common ground and show that he was committed to making amends. Kemi, too, was cautious. She was grateful for her father's return and wanted to believe that he had changed, but she had grown up without him and had learned to rely on Akin for everything. Letting someone new into her life, even if that person was her father, wasn't easy. Despite her reservations, Kemi allowed Ade into her world little by little. She appreciated his efforts to be involved in her life, though she still looked to Akin for guidance and support. The bond between the siblings remained unbreakable, a source of strength for both of them as they navigated this new reality. One evening, a few weeks after Ade's return, Kemi sat in her room, staring at the pages of a book but not really reading. Her thoughts were tangled, a mix of confusion and hope. She heard a soft knock on the door and looked up to see Akin standing in the doorway. "Hey," Akin said, stepping into the room. "You okay?" Kemi nodded, though she didn't really feel okay. "Yeah, I'm just thinking." Akin sat down on the edge of her bed, his presence comforting. "About Dad," Kemi sighed, closing the book and setting it aside. "Yeah, I want to believe he's changed, Akin. I really do. But what if he leaves again? What if he hurts us again?" Akin reached out and took her hand, squeezing it gently. "I know it's scary, Kemi. And I won't lie to you, it might happen. People make mistakes, and sometimes they make them again. But I also think, if we don't give him a chance, we'll never know if he really has changed." Kemi looked down at their hands, her voice barely above a whisper. "Do you think he's really sorry?" Akin hesitated, thinking carefully before answering. "I think he is, but that doesn't mean everything's going to be perfect. It's going to take time, and we'll have to be careful. But we've been through a lot already, Kemi. We can handle this too." Kemi nodded slowly, her trust in Akin unwavering. "Okay. I'll try." Akin smiled, a hint of pride in his eyes. "That's all we can do." As the days turned into weeks, the family settled into a new routine. Ade was careful not to overstep, respecting the boundaries that Akin and Kemi had set. He worked hard to prove his sincerity, even though it was clear that fully regaining their trust would be a long and difficult journey. E.W.T, however, remained distant. She interacted with Ade only when necessary, and even then, it was with a coldness that bordered on hostility. She hadn't forgiven him, and she wasn't sure she ever would. The betrayal had cut too deep, and seeing Ade in their home again only reopened old wounds. One night, after Kemi had gone to bed, E.W.T found herself alone in the kitchen with Ade. The tension between them was palpable, the air thick with unresolved emotions. Ade cleared his throat, breaking the uncomfortable silence. "E.W.T, he began, his voice tentative, "I know I've hurt you more than anyone else. And I know that what I did is unforgivable. But I need you to know that I'm truly sorry. Not just for leaving, but for everything. For not being the husband and father you deserved." E.W.T kept her gaze on the sink, her hands gripping the edge of the counter. "You think an apology is enough, Ade? Do you think words can erase the years of pain? The years I spent raising our children alone, dealing with the aftermath of your betrayal?" Ade shook his head, his expression filled with regret. "No, I don't. I know I can't undo what I've done. But I want to do better now. I want to be here for you, For Akin, for Kemi. I want to make things right, even if it's only in the smallest way. E.W.T finally turned to face him, her eyes cold and distant. You can't make things right, Ade. You can't fix what's been broken. But if you truly care about our children, you'll stay this time. You'll prove that you're not just here to ease your own guilt. Ade nodded, accepting the harsh truth of her words. I will stay, E.W.T. No matter how hard it gets, I'm not going anywhere. E.W.T studied him for a long moment, searching his face for any sign of deception. When she found none, she nodded curtly. Then stay, but don't expect forgiveness from me. I'm doing this for our children, not for you. With that, she turned and left the kitchen, leaving Ade standing alone in the dim light. He knew that earning E.W.T's forgiveness might never happen, but he was determined to stay and be the father his children needed, even if it meant enduring her coldness. The months that followed were a taste of patience and resilience for everyone. Ade continued to work hard to rebuild his relationship with Akin and Kemi, but he understood that trust was not something that could be regained overnight. He made an effort to be present at every moment, no matter how small, hoping that his consistency would eventually win them over. Akin, despite his initial reservations, began to see that his father was sincere. There were still moments of tension between them, but slowly, a fragile bond started to form. It wasn't the father-son relationship Akin had once dreamed of, but it was a start. They talked more openly, shared stories from the past, and even began to plan for the future, something Akin had never done with Ade before. Kemi, too, started to open up more to Ade. She allowed herself to hope that he would stay, that he wouldn't disappear like before. She enjoyed the small things they did together, like cooking dinner or playing games in the evening. But the fear of abandonment lingered, a shadow that she couldn't fully shake. One evening, as they sat around the dinner table, Kemi asked a question that had been on her mind for weeks. Dad, why did you come back now? After all these years? Ade looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and hope. I came back because I couldn't live with the regret anymore. I realized that I'd lost the most important thing in my life, my family. And I didn't want to spend the rest of my life wondering what could have been. I wanted to try, even if it was too late. Kemi nodded, absorbing his words. Do you think we can ever be a real family again? Ade hesitated, choosing his words carefully. I think we can be a new kind of family, Kemi. It won't be like before, and it won't be perfect. But we can make it work, together. Akin, who had been listening quietly, spoke up. It's not going to be easy, Dad. But I'm willing to try, for Kemi's sake. Ade smiled at his son, gratitude shining in his eyes. Thank you, Akin. That means more to me than you know. E.W.T, who had been silently eating her dinner, looked at the three of them and felt a pang of something she hadn't felt in a long time, hope. She had spent so many years in pain, holding onto her anger like a shield, that she had forgotten what it felt like to hope for something better. She wasn't ready to forgive Ade, but she could see that he was trying, that he was committed to making things right. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough for now. As the weeks turned into months, the family began to find a new rhythm. It wasn't perfect, and there were still moments of tension and uncertainty. But they were together, and that was more than there had been in a long time. Akin found himself slowly easing up on his protective role over Kemi, allowing her to build her own relationship with their father. It wasn't easy. He had spent so many years being her guardian that it felt strange to step back. But he could see that Kemi was happier with a day in her life, and that made it worth it. Kemi, for her part, started to feel more secure. She knew that her father wasn't going anywhere this time, and that knowledge gave her a sense of peace she hadn't known before. She still relied on Akin, but she also began to lean on Ade, allowing herself to trust him more and more each day. And Ade, despite the long road ahead, felt a deep sense of gratitude. He knew that he could never fully make up for the past, but he was determined to be the father and the man his children needed. Every day was a new chance to prove himself, and he embraced each one with a humility that had been absent in his younger years. E.W.T started to love Kemi as her own and forgave Ade. The end.